Welcome back, my Empire family. I'm not even going to pretend I didn't see the comments. Where are the boys at school? Is the rival group coming back? Did Sua really say back at the end of part 3, or did I imagine that? You did not imagine it. She really said it. And I cried writing it, so we're even. Part 4 is here. The boys are 19 now, deep into their second semester, finally settled into the rhythm of a life that is theirs, and theirs alone for the first time. There is a lecture hall. There are 3 girls in that lecture hall who do not move out of the way. There is a campus that has never seen anything like the Triplets before, and does not know what to do with itself. And back at the house in the hills, there is a woman about to walk into her husband's company, for the first time, as something other than his wife. This one is sweet. This one is loud. This one is going to make you scream at your screen by the end, so settle in. Please like, share, comment, and hit that subscribe button so Afro-Korean Drama Empire finds you every single time. Tell the group chat. Tell the one friend who has been sleeping on this story. Let's go back to the family. The university occupied a hillside campus on the northern edge of the city, old stone buildings beside glass ones, cherry trees that had gone from bare to riotous in the space of 2 weeks, and a population of several thousand students who had, within the first month of the semester, organized their entire social understanding of the place around 3 specific facts. The brothers were identical in face and entirely distinct in everything else. They had arrived in 3 different cars that nobody had ever seen the make of before, and they were, without a single one of them trying, the most discussed people on campus. Taeyoon walked across the quad on a Tuesday morning with his bag over one shoulder and his expression at its usual baseline of contained assessment, and 3 separate clusters of students stopped talking as he passed and resumed talking at a noticeably higher pitch, the moment he was 10 feet beyond them. He was aware of this. He had been aware of it since the first week. He found it neither flattering nor especially interesting, which was its own kind of remarkable, given how most 19-year-olds responded to that particular attention. Jun-so, walking the opposite direction with his football kit bag, and the loose, easy energy of someone who had already made 40 friends and intended to make 40 more, waved at people he barely knew, with the specific warmth that made strangers feel chosen. 3 girls from his economics class detoured slightly to walk past him. He did not appear to notice this was a detour. He simply said good morning to all 3, with the same wide grin he gave everyone, and all 3 nearly tripped over the same patch of perfectly flat pavement. Hajin moved through campus the way he moved through everything, quiet and unhurried, a book under one arm, his eyes taking in considerably more than his face let on. He attracted a different kind of attention than his brothers, less immediate and more accumulating. The kind that built slowly, as people noticed the specific stillness of him, the way he answered questions in seminar, with answers that were short and precise, and somehow always the thing the professor had been hoping someone would say. The girls of the university had organized themselves, by the end of the first month, into a rough and widely understood hierarchy of who had spoken to which brother, who had been spoken to first, and whose attempts had been politely and completely deflected. Jun-so deflected the most, because Jun-so talked to everyone and therefore appeared, to the untrained observer, to be available to everyone, when in fact he was simply incapable of being unkind to a person who approached him with warmth. Taeyoon deflected with the least effort, a brief acknowledgement and a return to whatever he had been doing, which discouraged repeat attempts more effectively than outright rejection would have. Ha-jin deflected so gently that most people did not realize they had been deflected until they were halfway back across the quad, replaying the conversation and slowly understanding that nothing had actually happened in it. None of the 3 had shown any sustained interest in anyone. This had become, by month 2, a topic of considerable campus speculation, addressed with theories ranging from, they're too rich to care, to maybe they're saving themselves for someone equally rich, which Jun-so had overheard once in the dining hall and had laughed about for 2 full days. The triplets had each found their footing in a different direction, which surprised no one who had watched them grow up, and surprised everyone who had only just met them. Taehyun had gone to the architecture department within the first week, his mentorship with the historian from the previous year having sharpened an interest into something closer to a calling, and had been placed, after a portfolio review that the department had described to a colleague as the most assured first-year submission she had seen in a decade, into an advanced studio that was technically meant for upperclassmen. He had also, almost as an aside, joined the university's competitive debate team, where his particular gift for dismantling an argument with calm, devastating precision had made him team captain by the end of the first semester, a position usually reserved for 3rd or 4th years. He approached debate the way he approached everything that mattered to him, with total preparation and a complete absence of theatrical flourish, which made him terrifying to face and oddly difficult to dislike, because he never gloated. He simply finished, and the room understood what had happened. Jun-so had walked onto the football field in the first week of tryouts, and had been, within 20 minutes, the obvious answer to a question the coaching staff had not yet finished asking. He played with the same full-bodied, joyful commitment he brought to every other part of his life, and he was named team captain by October, not because he was technically the most skilled player on the roster, though he was close, but because the entire team played better when he was on the field, lifted by an energy that was contagious, in a way coaches spent careers trying to manufacture and rarely found. He had also picked up boxing in his spare time, training 3 mornings a week at a gym near campus, with an instructor who had once trained professionally, because, as he explained to his brothers, football was for Saturdays, and a person needed something for the rest of the week too. Ha-jin had found his way, with the quiet inevitability that surrounded all his decisions, into the business school's most selective seminar, a small invitation-only course on organizational strategy that the professor ran like a private consultancy, and had also, in a move that surprised exactly no one who actually knew him, begun shadowing his father 1 weekend a month, sitting in on the legitimate side of the business, the logistics firm, and the security consultancy, asking questions that made senior executives twice his age pause before answering. He had told Aaliyah on a video call in week 3 that he found the architecture of how power actually moved through an organization more interesting than almost anything he had studied, and that he intended to understand all of it, properly, before he was 25. She had told him that did not surprise her even slightly. He had said he knew it wouldn't, which was, from Ha-jin, a joke, and she had laughed the laugh that filled whatever room it was in, 400 kilometers away through a phone screen, and he had smiled at the sound of it, the way he always did. The lecture hall belonged to a course called Comparative Political Systems, a required class that drew students from across the university into a tiered room that seated 200 and felt, on a Monday morning, like the entire weight of everyone's unfinished sleep gathered in one place. Tae-yoon arrived early, as he always did, and took his usual seat in the 3rd row, slightly left of center, the seat with the clearest sightline to the lectern and the least direct sun through the high windows. He set up his laptop and his notebook beside it, because some things were still better recorded by hand, and waited with the patient stillness that had been his since he was 7 minutes old, and had decided, apparently, that the world would come to him. 3 girls walked in together on the 2nd week of the semester, and changed the entire temperature of the room, without appearing to notice they had done it. They were unmistakably triplets. The same warm brown skin, the same sharp cheekbones, the same exact height, dressed in completely different styles, that nonetheless shared an obvious sensibility, the kind of confidence that came from people who had never once needed anyone's permission to take up space. They walked in talking to each other, mid-argument about something that had clearly started before they entered the building, and the argument did not pause for the room, did not pause for the fact that 200 students had turned to look, did not pause at all. I'm telling you, the data doesn't support a parliamentary system being inherently more stable, the one in the front said, dropping into a seat in the 2nd row, with the particular force of someone settling an old score rather than finding a chair. You're confusing stability with the appearance of stability. I'm not confusing anything, Kizani, the one beside her said, sliding in next to her. I'm saying the coalition mechanism builds in. You're both wrong, the 3rd one said, taking the aisle seat with the calm authority of someone used to being the deciding vote in an argument she had not started. And we're going to be late finishing this if we keep going, so let's just hear what the professor says first. Tae-yoon, 2 rows back and slightly to the left, had stopped writing. He had not meant to stop writing. He had been mid-sentence in his notes, transcribing the syllabus overview from the slide, and his pen had simply paused on the page, somewhere around the 2nd sentence the middle one had said, the one about coalition mechanisms, because it was, he noted with the part of his brain that never fully turned off the assessment function, an unusually sophisticated point for a first-week comment made in passing while walking to a seat. He looked at the 3 of them for exactly the length of time that was professionally deniable. Then he resumed writing. Jun-so, who had wandered into the same lecture as an elective and had taken the seat directly beside his brother with the specific intention of making the class more interesting through commentary, leaned over and murmured, "You're staring." "I'm not staring. You stopped writing for 4 full seconds. I counted. I was thinking about the syllabus. You were thinking about the one in the middle." Jun-so's grin had the particular wattage it acquired when he had identified something he intended to enjoy thoroughly. "The one who said the thing about coalitions. I don't know what you're referring to." Tae-yoon. Jun-so said it with the specific delight of a brother who had waited 19 years for exactly this moment. "I have known you our entire lives. You have never once looked at anyone the way you just looked at her for those 4 seconds. Tae-yoon did not answer. He underlined something in his notes that did not need underlining. The professor began the lecture. The 3 girls in the 2nd row settled, mostly, though the one called Kizani continued making small, sharp comments under her breath, at intervals that suggested the original argument had simply gone underground, rather than ended. Tae-yoon, against his own explicit instructions to himself, found his attention returning to the middle one more often than the material strictly required. She was the quietest of the 3, during the lecture itself, taking notes with a focused economy of motion, occasionally raising her hand to ask a question that was, every single time, precisely targeted at the weakest point in whatever the professor had just claimed. The 3rd time she did this, the professor visibly recalibrated his next sentence before delivering it, which Tae-yoon recognized immediately as the specific tell of someone who has just been outmaneuvered and is choosing their words more carefully as a result. He had produced that exact recalibration in professors and debate opponents more times than he could count. He had never seen anyone do it to a professor in week 2 of an introductory course. After class, the 3 girls filed out together, still talking, the argument having apparently evolved into something about electoral thresholds that none of the surrounding students could fully follow. Tae-hyun packed his bag with deliberate slowness. Go talk to her, Jun-so said. I have a debate practice in 20 minutes. You have a debate practice in 50 minutes. I know your schedule better than you know it yourself. You've made me memorize it twice. Tae-hyun zipped his bag. He looked toward the door where the three girls had gone. He did not move toward it. Coward, Jun-so said, with affection, and slung his own bag over his shoulder, and the two of them left the lecture hall together. And somewhere in the corridor outside, the girl called Kazani was saying, to her sisters, "Did you see the one staring at us? 2 rows back." "Which one?" the third sister said. There were 2 of them, and they looked exactly alike. "The one who didn't laugh," Kazani said. "The serious one." "They're triplets," the middle one said. The one who had asked the precise questions, adjusting her bag strap with the specific lack of interest of someone who had clocked the attention and filed it under irrelevant. Half the campus has been talking about them since week 1. Apparently they're rich and Korean, and they're all supposed to be unbelievably charming. "He didn't seem charming," Kazani said. "He seemed like he was conducting an audit." "That's worse." "Or better?" the third sister asked. "Undetermined," Kazani said. The middle one, whose name was Kayomi, said nothing further on the subject, and walked ahead of her sisters toward the next building with the specific brisk pace of someone who had already decided this was not a topic worth additional sentences. She thought about it again that evening anyway, briefly, while making notes for the following week's reading, and decided that the thinking about it was simply residual curiosity from an unusual encounter, and would resolve itself naturally within a few days. It did not resolve itself within a few days. The house in the hills above Seoul, in the absence of 3 teenage boys, and the noise that had organized itself around them for 19 years, had reorganized into a quieter and entirely different kind of full. The twins, 2.5 years old now, and fully fluent in the specific authority that came with having an opinion about everything, filled the spaces that had once belonged to football kit bags and debate notebooks and the low hum of 3 brothers negotiating the bathroom schedule. And Aaliyah had discovered, in the months since the boys left for university, that a house could hold 2 distinct kinds of loud at the same time, the kind that had left and the kind that remained, and that missing the first did not diminish her gratitude for the second even slightly. She video called the boys every Sunday evening without exception, a ritual that had established itself in the first week they were gone and had not wavered since, conducted from the kitchen counter, where the family laptop lived, propped against the spice rack, the twins climbing onto the stools beside her, with the specific urgency of small people, who understood that this was their time too, and had no intention of being excluded from it. "Are you eating?" she would ask every single week, in the exact tone she had used the very first call, because some questions were not meant to be varied. They were meant to be a ritual, a thread pulled taut across a city's distance that reminded everyone holding it that the other end was still there. "We're eating, Mom," Tae-hyun would say, with the specific patience of someone who had answered this question 15 times and intended to keep answering it without complaint for as long as it was asked. "Properly," she would clarify. "Not the ramen with the handwriting on it. Real food." "I made the spice rice on Thursday," Jun-so would say, leaning into frame with his face too close to the camera the way he always did, as if proximity to the screen brought him proximity to her. "It was almost as good as yours." Tae-hyun said it was acceptable, which from him is basically a standing ovation. "It was adequate," Tae-hyun would say, from somewhere off-screen. "He's lying, it was good." Ha-jin, on these calls, tended to say less and watch more, his face occupying a smaller portion of the frame because he sat further back, his eyes moving across the kitchen behind her, the spice rack, the window, the small details of home that he cataloged the way he cataloged everything, quietly and completely, and at some point in nearly every call he would ask a single specific question that revealed he had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. "Is the gate light on the east side still flickering? Did Secretary Bay's knee improve after the appointment? Are the twins still refusing the green vegetables, or has that resolved?" It was on one of these calls, in the 11th week of the semester, that the twins delivered the moment that would be discussed in the family group chat for the following 3 days. Sua and Ji-ah had begun Korean lessons 2 months prior, formal ones, with a tutor that Aaliyah had hired specifically because she wanted her daughter's Korean to be something they owned completely, rather than something absorbed in fragments, and the girls had taken to it with the same committed intensity they brought to everything. Sua, methodical and precise in her vocabulary. Ji-ah, enthusiastic and occasionally inventive with grammar, in ways that made the tutor laugh more than correct. On the Sunday call in week 11, Sufa, perched on her stool with her chin nearly at counter height, looked at the screen where all 3 brothers had crowded into frame to wave, and said, with the clear, deliberate pride of someone deploying new vocabulary for the very first time in front of an audience that mattered, "Oppa." The screen went still. "Oppa," Ji-ah repeated, immediately, not to be outdone, pointing at the screen with the specific emphatic gesture she used when she wanted full credit for an idea. Jun-so's mouth fell open. Actually fell open, his hand coming up to his chest in the universal gesture of a person who has just been hit somewhere unprotected. "Did she just?" Tae-hyun started, and then stopped, because his own voice had done something unexpected on the word just. "Say it again," Jun-so said, leaning so close to the camera that his face filled the entire screen, his eyes bright. "Sua, say it again, Please, I need to hear it again. Appa, Suah said, with the specific patience of a teacher repeating something for a slow student, and Jia said it again too, at higher volume, apparently delighted by the response it had produced. Hajin, in the back of the frame, had gone quiet in the particular way that meant something large was moving through him. He leaned forward slowly until his face was level with his brother's in the frame, and looked at his sisters through the screen, with his large calm eyes gone unusually bright, and said, in Korean, soft and careful, "Say it one more time. For me." Jia, who had developed a specific fondness for being the one Hajin asked things of, looked directly into the camera with tremendous seriousness and said, "Hajin Oppa." The kitchen, 400 kilometers away, fell into a silence that Aaliyah would later describe to Woo Jin as the loudest silence she had ever heard, because all three of the brothers had gone completely still and completely overcome at the exact same moment, the way they had been since they were born, hitting the same emotional note in perfect unintentional unison. Junso recovered first, because Junso always recovered first, and what he recovered into was full, unrestrained, gleeful noise, a sound that was half laugh and half something with considerably more weight underneath it. "Okay, that's it. I'm coming home this weekend. I don't care if I have practice. I need to hold both of them immediately." "You have a match Saturday," Taeyun said, his own voice still not entirely steady. "I'll come home after the match. I'm still coming." Aaliyah watched her sons through the screen, the three of them crowded together, undone by 2 syllables from their little sisters in a language they were just learning to claim as their own, and she felt the specific fullness in her chest that had been arriving more frequently since the twins were born, and had never once become less than it was the first time. "They've been practicing all week," she told them, once the noise settled into something closer to coherent sentences. "Suah wanted to get the pronunciation exactly right before she said it to you. She made the tutor repeat it 9 times. 9 times, Taeyun said, looking at Suah through the screen, with an expression that had nothing professionally contained about it. "You practiced 9 times. Suah nodded, with the solemn satisfaction of someone whose preparation had clearly paid off. "I practiced too," Jia said, slightly defensive, unwilling to let her sister claim sole credit for diligence. "You practiced 2 times, and then got bored," Suah said. "I practiced enough times," Jia said, with the specific finality of someone closing a debate she had no intention of losing. Hajin, still leaning close to the screen, looked at both of them and said, quietly, in the voice he used for things that mattered most, "Thank you for practicing. Both of you. However many times it was." The call ran 20 minutes longer than usual that evening, and ended, as it always did, with all 3 boys saying goodnight to the twins, individually, by name, and the twins saying goodnight back, and Aaliyah closing the laptop afterward and sitting in the quiet kitchen for a moment, feeling the specific warmth of a family that had learned, across 2 continents worth of distance and 19 years worth of history, exactly how to hold itself together. Woo Jin had appeared in the kitchen doorway partway through the call, as he often did on Sunday evenings, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching his sons through the screen with the open, unguarded expression that the house alone produced in him. He had not said anything during the Appa moment. He had simply pressed his hand briefly over his mouth and looked, for several seconds, like a man experiencing something too large for the room to contain. "You heard all of that," Aaliyah said, once the call had ended. "I heard all of it," he said. "You're going to need to compose yourself before Monday," she said. "You have a board meeting." "I'm aware," he said, and crossed the kitchen, and pulled her against him, his chin resting on top of her head, and they stood there for a moment in the quiet house, the twins already drifting toward the living room, to resume whatever elaborate game they had paused for the call, and he said, into her hair, "Did you know they were planning that?" "I had a suspicion," she said. "I didn't ask for details. I wanted it to land the way it landed." "It landed," he said. "It landed," she agreed. Monday morning, the company headquarters occupied the upper 12 floors of a glass tower in Gangnam, the legitimate face of an empire that ran on precision and discretion in equal measure, and Aaliyah stood in the marble lobby at 8 in the morning in a deep emerald wrap dress, fitted at the waist, and falling in soft folds over her full curvy figure. Her natural hair pulled into the elegant twisted updo she had practiced twice the night before, until it sat exactly right, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the specific nervous energy of a first day. It had been her decision, made over several months of quiet consideration and one direct conversation with Woo Jin in his study that had started with her saying, "I want to do something that's mine, separate from the house, separate from being your wife, something that uses what I'm actually good at," and had ended with him agreeing within minutes, because he had, in fact, been waiting for exactly this conversation for the better part of a year. "You run a household of 7 people and an extended staff, with more efficiency than most of my division heads run their departments," he had told her. "You've been doing the job already. I'd just like to pay you for it somewhere other than in love and gratitude." She had laughed at that, the real one, and had said she wanted to start somewhere specific, the Community Relations and Cultural Integration Division, a small department that handled the company's relationships with its international partners and its growing roster of foreign employees, a department that had existed on paper for years and had never quite found its footing, because, as she had told him, She knew exactly what it felt like to walk into a country, and a culture, and a language that did not automatically make room for you. And she thought she could build something there that mattered. He had agreed. He had also, against her specific instruction, made certain that everyone in the building understood precisely who she was before she arrived, not out of any need to leverage his position on her behalf, but because he had decided, in his own quiet and absolute way, that his wife would never walk into any room in his company, and be made to feel like she had to prove she belonged there. The elevator opened onto the 14th floor at 8:15, and the open-plan office that greeted her was already at its morning capacity, dozens of employees at their desks, and the moment she stepped out, a ripple moved through the room with the specific speed of information that had clearly been anticipated. The first person to stand was a woman near the front desk, who rose and bowed, not the brief courtesy nod of casual workplace greeting, but a full, proper bow, and said, "Welcome, Mrs. M." And then the ripple became a wave, desk by desk, person by person, rising and bowing in sequence across the entire floor, dozens of employees standing in their places and inclining their heads with a respect that had clearly been discussed and prepared, and was being delivered with genuine warmth rather than obligation. Aaliyah stood very still for a moment, taking in the full scope of it. 200 people on their feet in welcome, and felt something rise in her chest that she had not been fully prepared for. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet floor, and inclined her own head in return, the specific gesture of respect she had practiced, and that came easily now after years of living inside this language and this culture. "Thank you. All of you. I'm looking forward to working alongside everyone here." The floor returned to its motion gradually, conversations resuming, people settling back into their chairs, but the warmth of the greeting lingered in the room, in a way that followed her down the corridor, toward the small office that had been prepared for her, and she thought, walking past desks where people glanced up and smiled, genuinely, that this was not the reception of a boss's wife being humored. This was something closer to welcome. Not everyone on the 14th floor had stood with the same warmth. Min Jung, a senior manager in the Strategic Partnerships Division, who had been with the company for 6 years and had spent the last 3 of them in a state of carefully concealed and entirely one-sided fixation on Im Woo Jin, that she described to herself as professional admiration, and that everyone who had ever watched her in a room with him, recognized as something considerably less professional, had remained seated for a fraction of a second longer than everyone around her before standing, and her bow, when it came, was technically correct and entirely without warmth. She had heard about the marriage years ago, the way the whole company had heard, in the specific hushed tones reserved for news about the chairman's personal life. She had told herself, at the time and in the years since, that it did not matter, that proximity to him in meetings and projects was its own kind of relevance, that whatever happened in his private life had no bearing on whatever she had built for herself inside this company. She had told herself this with diminishing conviction every time she found a reason to walk past his office, every time she volunteered for projects that required direct reporting to him, every time she had, in the privacy of her own apartment, imagined a version of events that did not include the woman she had only ever seen in a handful of company event photographs. Watching that woman walk onto the 14th floor in person, with the entire office rising for her, with the chairman's own clear and evident devotion radiating off her like something structural, was an entirely different experience than seeing her in a photograph. And Min Jung sat back down at her desk after the bowing ended, with her jaw set and her composure intact on the surface, and something considerably less intact underneath it. She watched, instead, from across the floor, as the new community relations director moved through her first day with an ease that suggested she had no idea anyone in the room was watching her with anything other than welcome, and she filed away the specific shape of her own discomfort, the way a person files away something they intend to revisit later. The first week proceeded, for Aaliyah, with the particular satisfaction of a person doing work that fit her exactly. She restructured the onboarding process for the company's growing number of foreign hires within 4 days, sitting down individually with each one to understand what specific friction they had encountered in adjusting to both the company and the country, and producing a document by the end of the week that the head of human resources described, in a meeting Woo Jin attended without comment, as the most useful internal report the division had generated in 3 years. She had lunch on Thursday with 3 of the company's junior foreign employees, a young man from Nigeria, a woman from Vietnam, and a man from Kenya, all of whom had been hired in the past 18 months, and all of whom had separately told her, in the careful, slightly surprised tone of people who had not expected anyone in leadership to actually ask, that the hardest part of working here had nothing to do with the work itself, and everything to do with the specific loneliness of being the only person in a room who looked like them, who spoke their first language, who understood the particular weight of small daily things that no one around them thought to notice. She understood that loneliness completely. She built, over the following weeks, an entire program around dismantling it. Woo Jin found her in her office on Friday evening, the floor mostly empty, the city beginning to light up gold through the windows behind her, and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work, before she noticed him. "How was the first week?" he asked, though he already knew, because he had heard from 3 separate department heads by Wednesday, that the new community relations director was, in the words of one particularly understated executive, exceeding expectations to an uncomfortable degree. "Good," she said, looking up. "Really good." She closed her laptop. I forgot how much I like this. Not the house. I love the house. I love our life there. But this specific feeling of building something that's just mine. You've earned every part of it, he said, crossing the office, and she stood and met him halfway, and he held her for a moment in the quiet golden light of the office, his chin against her hair, and said, "The whole building is talking about you. Good things, I hope." "Mostly good things," he said. She pulled back slightly and looked at him. "Mostly," he told her. Then, with the careful economy of a man who did not enjoy delivering information that might worry his wife, and had decided the better course was simply to be direct about it, that he had noticed Min Jung's reaction at the welcome, that he had clocked it the way he clocked everything in rooms he controlled, and that he wanted Aaliyah to be aware of it, not because it concerned him in any operational sense, but because he had learned, across 2 years of marriage, that the things that affected his wife mattered enough to mention, even when they were small. "I noticed her too," Aaliyah said. "The one who sat a second too long. You noticed." "I notice everything, Woo Jin. I raised 3 teenage boys who had a notebook about evicting maids. I notice everything," she said it lightly, but there was a thread of something underneath it. An old, familiar wariness that came from years of being assessed by people who had already decided what category to put her in before she opened her mouth. "She's not a threat to anything," Woo Jin said, with the specific certainty that came from a man who had never once, in 2 years, given his wife a single reason to doubt where his attention lived. "I want you to know that clearly, in case you were carrying any version of a worry about it." "I wasn't worried," Aaliyah said. "I was just noticing." She looked at him for a moment. "But thank you for telling me anyway, that matters." He claimed her lips already lustful in the warmth in her eyes, and Aaliyah snickered in his mouth. He lifted her onto the table in her office, kissing her deeply, and she was deeply lustful for this man she had fallen so deeply for. She didn't care about anything else. She didn't care if anyone was coming into the office. She wanted him to do more to her. "Want to make more babies?" Woo Jin asked with a devilish smile, and Aaliyah tapped out immediately, arranging her dress. She had been running away from that, and this man knew how to threaten her with it. "I don't like you," Aaliyah said, and he laughed at her childishness. He kissed her forehead, and they left the office together, and across the empty floor, in the dimmed light of the strategic partnership section, Min Jung sat at her desk, pretending to finish an email she had actually finished 20 minutes earlier. Watching the chairman and his wife walk to the elevator together, with the specific, unhurried ease of 2 people who had never once doubted each other, and felt the particular bitterness of a person watching something she had wanted for years belong, completely and unshakably, to someone else. The semester moved forward at university, with the specific velocity of a system finding its rhythm, and the lecture hall on Mondays and Wednesdays became, without anyone officially declaring it so, the place where Taeseun's week organized itself around 40 minutes of trying not to be obvious about where his attention went. He had learned her name by week 3, Kalmami. He had also learned, through the particular intelligence-gathering network that existed on every campus, and that Jun-So had access to through sheer force of having befriended literally everyone, that she was pre-law, that she had come from Houston originally, that her family had moved to Seoul 4 years prior, when her father took a position with an international firm, that she and her 2 sisters, Kazani and the third one, Kamari, had grown up moving between countries, and had developed, in response, the specific armor of people who had learned not to need anyone's approval, to feel like they belonged somewhere. He had also learned, mostly through observing her directly, rather than through Jun-So's network, that she was formidably, almost unfairly intelligent, that she argued with the specific precision he recognized, because it was the same precision he brought to debate, that she did not laugh easily, but that when she did, it was sudden and complete, the kind of laugh that surprised even her, and that she had not, in 3 weeks of his careful and entirely covert attention, shown any sign of having noticed him noticing her. This last fact bothered him more than he would have expected. He approached her, finally, in week 4, after a lecture in which the professor had posed a particularly thorny question about electoral system design, and Kaomi had answered it with an argument so clean and complete that Taeyeon had found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely impressed by someone who was not a member of his own family. He waited until the lecture ended, until her sisters had drifted ahead toward the door, still mid-argument about something unrelated, and fell into step beside her with the deliberate, unhurried pace he used for things that mattered. "That was a good answer," he said. "The point about coalition incentive structures, most people in this class haven't connected that to the comparative case studies yet." She glanced at him, taking him in with the specific brief, complete assessment he recognized, because it was identical to the one he gave people himself. "Thanks," she said. Not unfriendly. Not warm either. The flat, even tone of someone accustomed to compliments and unmoved by them. "You're pre-law." "I am. I noticed you ask good questions. I notice you stop writing whenever I talk," she said, and kept walking. Taeyoon's step did not falter, though something in his chest did. "I'm taking notes on the lecture content." "Sure," she said, with a specific dry inflection that suggested she did not believe this, even slightly, and had no intention of pretending otherwise to spare his feelings. "Look, I know who you are. Half the campus has done a full presentation on the Triplets to me, whether I asked for it or not. Rich, charming, untouchable, every girl on campus has a theory about which one of you she's going to end up with." She stopped at the door, finally, and looked at him directly, and her eyes had the same exact sharpness he had been noticing for 4 weeks. I'm not really interested in being someone's theory. I haven't presented you with a theory, Taeyun said. You've been staring at me for a month. He did not deny it. He had decided, somewhere in the 4 weeks of watching her dismantle arguments with surgical calm, that lying about something this simple was beneath both of them. I have, he said. I find you interesting. That's not a theory, it's an observation. Something flickered across her face, quick and immediately suppressed. Everyone finds rich and charming interesting, she said. That's not exactly hard to manufacture. I'm not trying to manufacture anything, he said. I haven't said a single thing to you in 4 weeks, because I wanted to be sure it would be true when I finally said something. I don't do things I haven't thought through. Kaomi looked at him for a long moment, the specific assessing look that he recognized, because his own father had given him versions of it his entire life. The look of a person who had learned the hard way that charm was often a tool wielded by people with something to gain, and had decided the safest position was permanent, well-defended skepticism. My sisters and I don't impress easily, she said, just so you understand the landscape correctly, before you decide whether this is worth your effort. I've noticed, Taeyun said. It's one of the things I find interesting. She did not smile. But she also did not walk away immediately, which, for a woman who had walked away from considerably less complicated conversations in the previous 3 weeks, without a backward glance, registered as something. I have class, she said, finally. I know your schedule, Taeyun said. Then, hearing it land slightly differently than he had intended, added, Junso's network. Not me. Personally. Tracking you. A fraction of an inch that she stopped almost as soon as it started. Goodbye, Taeyun, she said, his name delivered with the specific weight of someone confirming she had, in fact, learned it weeks ago too, and had simply chosen not to use it until now. She walked away. He watched her go, and did not move for several seconds, and Junsu, materializing at his shoulder from wherever he had been lurking with the specific timing of a brother, who had clearly been watching the entire exchange from a discreet distance, said, Did she just say your name? She's known it the whole time, Taeyun said. She just hadn't used it. That's basically a marriage proposal from someone like her, Junso said, delighted. I'm telling Mom. You are absolutely not telling Mom. I'm telling Mom tonight. He told Mom that night. Aaliyah, on the Sunday call, looked at Taeyun through the screen, with an expression of such complete, barely contained delight, that he had to look away from the camera entirely for several seconds, and said, Tell me everything, don't leave anything out. There is nothing to tell, Taeyun said. We had one conversation. He's been staring at her for a month, Junso reported, leaning into frame. He memorized her schedule. He called her interesting in the specific clinical way he calls a well-constructed legal argument interesting, which from him is basically poetry. I did not memorize her schedule. You provided it unsolicited. Hashiyun, in the back of the frame, said nothing for a moment, watching his brother with the specific quiet attention he gave things that mattered. Then he said, simply, What's she like? Beyond interesting. Taeyun was quiet for a moment, choosing the words the way he chose everything, carefully. She doesn't move, he said finally. Out of the way, for anything. She argues, like she's never once considered that she might be wrong, and half the time she's right, and the other half she's defending the position so completely that it doesn't matter that she's wrong, because watching her defend it is its own kind of education. He paused. I haven't met anyone like that since. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but Aaliyah, watching through the screen 400 kilometers away, finished it silently in her own head anyway. Since me. In his kitchen, 11 years old in spirit, if not in years, telling 3 boys who had never once met anyone who refused to flinch. Go slow, she told him, gently. If she's worth what you're describing, she's worth doing this carefully. Don't perform anything for her, just be exactly who you are, and let her decide if that's enough. That's what I'm doing, Taeyun said. Good, Aaliyah said. Because Taeyun baby, if she's the one who finally cracks that very controlled exterior of yours, I expect a full and immediate report. There will be no report because there's nothing happening. There's going to be a report, Junso said. I'll send it myself if he won't. Across the screen, Sua, who had been quietly coloring at the counter throughout this entire exchange with the specific absorbed focus she brought to most things, looked up suddenly and said, with no context whatsoever, Taeyun Appa has a girlfriend. The kitchen 400 kilometers away erupted. Taeyun put his face in his hands. Junsu laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. And Hajian, watching all of it with the warm, complete expression that had been arriving more and more often in the past year, said, quietly, to no one in particular, I like her already. Whoever she is. The weeks between the Appa moment and the end of the semester moved with the specific compressed fullness of a family operating well, even across distance, and the call and response rhythm of the Sunday evenings continued, each week adding a new small thread to the larger fabric. Junso's team, winning a match that he described in such exhaustive replay detail that Wu Jin eventually had to take the laptop and tell him they would watch the recording together, rather than hear it narrated twice. Hajin's seminar professor inviting him to co-author a short paper on organizational hierarchy that he discussed, with a careful, contained pride that took Aaliyah a full minute to recognize, because Hajin's pride had always lived quietly, underneath, rather than on the surface where it could be easily seen. Taeyun's reports on Kaomi arrived in smaller, more guarded pieces than his brother's news, delivered with the specific economy of a man protecting something he had decided was worth protecting before it was fully formed. He had walked beside her after 3 more lectures. She had, on the second of these walks, asked him an actual question about himself rather than deflecting his, "What is it like, growing up with 2 brothers who look exactly like you?" And he had answered honestly that it meant never once being entirely alone in anything, which he had only understood as a gift rather than a complication somewhere around the time Aaliyah arrived in their kitchen and showed all 3 of them what it looked like to be known completely as individuals rather than as a unit. Kaomi had listened to this with the focused attention she gave everything and had said, after a moment, that her own sisters had been the same kind of permanent witness to her whole life, that there was a specific safety in being seen by people who had been there for all of it. On the 3rd walk, she had laughed. The real one, sudden and complete, at something he had said about Junsu's network knowing things about strangers that the strangers themselves had forgotten, and the sound of it had caught him so completely off guard that he had stopped walking entirely for a moment, and she had looked back at him and asked what was wrong, and he had said nothing was wrong, that he simply hadn't expected the laugh, and she had looked at him for a long moment, with something shifting behind her eyes, something that was no longer quite the well-defended skepticism she had started with. Her sisters remained, throughout all of this, entirely unmoved. Kazani had told Kaomi directly, more than once, that she thought the whole thing was a mistake, that rich boys who had never once in their lives been told no, eventually became men who could not handle hearing it, and Kamari had simply watched from a careful distance, withholding judgment with the specific patience of the sister, who always waited longest to form an opinion, and was, when she finally did, almost always right. It was Kamari, in the end, who changed first, and she changed because of Hajin. She had ended up, through the specific accident of timetabling that governed so much of university social life, in the same small seminar Hajin attended on organizational strategy, one of only 12 students in the room, and had watched him for 3 weeks with the same flat, unimpressed assessment her sisters had given his brothers, before the professor posed a case study about a company collapsing under the weight of a founder who could not distribute trust to anyone beneath him, and asked the room what the founder had failed to understand. Most of the room offered some variation of the same answer, about delegation, about systems. Hajin, when called on, had said quietly that the founder had not failed to understand delegation. He had failed to understand that control and love were not the same instrument, and that he had spent so long trying to protect the company by holding every decision himself that he had never given anyone inside it room to prove they could be trusted with something real, and that businesses, like families, did not survive on control. They survived on people being given the chance to show they deserved trust, and then being trusted completely once they had. The room had been quiet for a moment after that. Kamari had looked at him across the seminar table with an expression that had shifted, slowly and completely, from her habitual unimpressed neutrality into something that looked considerably more like attention. She had approached him after class, which was, for Kamari, an almost unheard of departure from her established pattern of letting people approach her and waiting to see if they were worth the effort of a response. That was specific, she said. Most people in this seminar talk in theory. You talked like you'd actually watched it happen somewhere. I have, Hajin said, simply, with no further elaboration, because elaboration would have meant explaining his father, and his father's father, and the 11 years before Aaliyah walked through their door, and that was not a story for a seminar hallway. Kamari studied him for a long moment, the same sharp assessing look her sisters carried, and said, "You're the quiet one. I'm aware of my reputation." "It's not a bad reputation," she said, surprising herself slightly with the admission. "I find the loud ones tiring. My sister's currently being chased by your loud brother. The other one," she paused. "Your other brother is chasing my other sister in his own controlled, terrifying way." "I'm aware of that too," Hajin said. "It's been discussed extensively in our family group chat. Is that supposed to make this less weird? That all 6 of us are somehow doing this at the same time?" "I don't know if it's supposed to do anything," Hajin said. "I'm simply telling you the truth, which is what I generally do." He looked at her with his large, calm eyes, steady and unhurried. "I find you interesting, not because you're attached to 2 people my brothers happen to be interested in, because of what you said today, about the founder needing to feel needed more than he needed to be right. That was the actual point of the case study, and nobody else in the room got there." Something in Kamari's carefully maintained composure shifted, just slightly, the specific crack that happened when a person who had spent years building a particular kind of armor encountered someone who clearly wasn't trying to get past it through force, just patience. "I don't move easily," she said, "just so you understand what you'd be working with." "I don't expect you to," Hajin said. "I'm not in a hurry." She had not said anything further that day, but she had, the following week, sat 1 seat closer to him in the seminar, and the week after that, closer still, and by the time the semester reached its final stretch, the 3 Im brothers and the 3 Triplet sisters from Houston had arranged themselves, without any formal announcement to anyone, into 3 quiet, careful, entirely distinct versions of the same unlikely thing. Kezani held out longest, and held out hardest, true to the specific hot temper her sisters described, with equal parts exasperation and pride, and Jun-so, who had never in his life encountered a person immune to his particular warmth, found this both maddening and, against every instinct he had, the most compelling thing that had happened to him in years. She did not soften the way her sisters had. She argued with him constantly about everything, football tactics and music and the ethics of his family's wealth, which she raised directly and without apology in their third real conversation, asking him outright how he reconciled the comfort of his life with whatever his father's business actually was. And Jun-so, who could have deflected the way his brothers might have, chose instead to answer her honestly, that he did not fully know everything his father had done in the years before Aaliyah arrived, that he knew enough to understand it had not all been clean, that he had decided, watching his father become a different and better man over the past several years, that people were allowed to change completely, and that he intended to build whatever he built with his own life, in a way that he would never have to explain away to anyone. Kezani had looked at him for a long time after that answer, and had said, finally, that it was the first honest thing anyone with his kind of money had ever said to her without dressing it up first. She accepted, 2 weeks before the semester's end, an invitation to watch his final match of the season, sitting in the stands beside Kaomi and Kamari, with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, and when Jun-so scored the match-winning goal in the final minutes, and turned immediately, instinctively, to find her in the crowd, the look on his face so open and so completely unguarded that several hundred strangers around her noticed it too. Kezani had stood up out of her seat before she had decided to, and had not bothered sitting back down for the rest of the match. He had found her after, still in his kit, sweat-soaked and grinning, and she had said, before he could say anything, "Don't make this a whole thing." "I'm not making it a thing. You're smiling like it's a whole thing. I scored the winning goal. I'm allowed to smile." "That's not the smile you're doing right now," Kezani said, and he had laughed, the full helpless version, and had said simply, "Have dinner with me. Just dinner. No theory, no presentation, just food." She had said yes. She would later tell her sisters, in the privacy of their shared apartment, that she had surprised herself more than anyone by saying it, and that she still wasn't sure she liked it, and Kaomi had said that not liking it was usually the surest sign that she liked it more than she was willing to admit, and Kezani had thrown a cushion at her and refused to discuss it further that night. The end of the semester arrived on a Friday in early June, and the house in the hills above Seoul spent that final week in a state of preparation that mirrored, in its quiet intensity, the way the family always prepared for the boys' return. The kitchen stocked with everything Aaliyah knew they would want after months away, the rooms aired and refreshed, Secretary Bay coordinating the specific logistics of 3 separate arrival times because the boys, despite having driven to and from university countless times over the past year, were each arriving from slightly different final commitments: Jun-so's last team gathering, Tae-yoon's final debate tournament, Ha-jin staying an extra day to finish his co-authored paper before driving home. The twins, now 2.5, and fully capable of tracking time in the specific, relentless way small children track the approach of something they have been promised, had begun asking every morning for 9 days straight whether today was the day the brothers were coming home, and Aaliyah had answered each time with the same patient warmth, "Soon, baby, soon," until the morning she could finally say yes. She dressed them that morning in matching soft yellow sundresses, their dark mixed heritage curls pulled into small twin puffs that she had learned, over 2.5 years, exactly how to style, without a single complaint from either girl, and she herself wore a flowing ivory linen dress, simple and cool against the early summer heat, her hair loose around her shoulders, and stood at the kitchen window with the girls pressed against the glass, watching the long driveway with the specific vigilance of children who had decided that watching constantly was the only acceptable strategy for not missing the moment. Taeyoon's car came first, the sleek black line of it turning up the drive just after 11 in the morning, and the moment its engine became audible, both girls were moving, small bare feet against the marble floor, the front door already being pulled open by Sua, with the specific determined strength of a 2.5-year-old who had been waiting 9 days and had no intention of waiting 1 second longer than necessary. "Tae-yoon oppa," Sua screamed, the word delivered at a volume that would have made the tutor proud, and that carried clear across the front lawn, and she was running before the car had even fully stopped, her small legs moving as fast as they could carry her. Jiza close behind her, both girls shrieking with the specific delighted abandon that only small children chasing someone they love can produce. Tae-yoon had barely gotten the car door open before Sua hit him, full force, wrapping both arms around his legs, with the kind of grip that suggested she intended to never release him again, and he laughed, the real one, sudden and full, and scooped her up in one motion, holding her against his chest as Jia arrived a half-second later and was lifted with his other arm, both girls talking at once, in a torrent of Korean and English mixed together, about 9 days of accumulated news that needed to be delivered immediately and without any particular order. "You came back," Sua said, pressing her small hand against his cheek, checking, the way she always checked, that he was real and present and not a screen. I told you I would, Taeyun said, and his voice had gone soft in the specific way it only went for his sisters. All the careful precision dropped away into something simpler. I'm here. Both of you. I'm here. Junso's car arrived 12 minutes later, and the scene repeated itself with the specific increase in volume that always accompanied Junso, both girls running again, screaming his name this time, and he was out of the car and on his knees on the gravel before they reached him, arms spread wide, and when they hit him, he went over backward onto the lawn entirely. Laughing, both girls collapsing on top of him in a heap of limbs and yellow sundresses and complete, uncomplicated joy, and he lay there in the grass with his sisters piled on his chest and said, to the sky, "This is the best welcome home I have ever received in my entire life." And Jia, lying directly on his stomach, said, with great seriousness, "I missed you the most." And Su-ah immediately protested that she had missed him equally, and the argument that followed was conducted entirely while still lying in a pile on the front lawn, and resolved itself only when Junso declared, with the diplomatic authority of an experienced sibling negotiator, that he had missed both of them exactly the same impossible amount, which satisfied everyone. Hajin arrived last, in the late afternoon, the forest green of his car catching the gold light as it came up the drive. And by then both girls had exhausted the running entirely, and were sitting on the front steps beside Aaliyah, tired in the specific way of children who had spent an entire day at peak emotional intensity. But the moment his car came into view, Jija was on her feet again, finding some final reserve of energy, and ran to meet him with her arms already raised before he had even opened the door. He lifted her the moment he was out of the car, and she settled against him with the specific quiet contentment she reserved only for him. Her face pressed into his neck, and he held her there for a long moment without saying anything, and then Su-ah arrived more slowly, walking rather than running, and he crouched down to her level and opened his free arm, and she walked directly into it and pressed her forehead against his jaw, the way she always had, since she was small enough to be carried in one arm, and he held both his sisters at once, quiet and complete, and said nothing for a long moment, simply standing in the driveway, in the gold evening light, with both of them gathered against him. "We learned a new word," Su-ah said, finally, muffled against his shoulder. "Tell me." "Bogo shipeo," she said, carefully, the way the tutor had taught her, and Jia repeated it too, both of them delivering the new phrase with the same careful pride they had brought to Oppa weeks earlier. Hajin went very still. The phrase meant, "I missed you," in the specific way Korean carried longing, the literal sense of wanting to see someone, and hearing it from two small girls who had spent 9 days waiting for exactly this moment, undid something in him that he did not bother trying to hide. "I missed you too," he said, in Korean, his voice not entirely steady. "Bogo shipeo. Both of you. Every single day." Aaliyah, watching from the steps with Woo Jin who had come out to stand beside her, felt the specific fullness rise in her chest that arrived every single time this family demonstrated, without trying, exactly what it had become. "They've been counting down," she told him quietly, "every morning for 9 days. "I know," he said. "Junso told me. He's been getting the daily countdown reports, same as you." He watched his sons across the lawn, Taishu now setting Su-ah down so he could properly greet his father, Junso still lying in the grass with Jia perched on his chest, Hajin holding both girls in the gold evening light, and the open, unmanaged expression on his face was the one the house alone produced. "I never thought I would have this," he said, quietly, mostly to himself. "Any of it." "You have it," Aaliyah said, slipping her hand into his. "All of it, forever." The week home settled into the specific warm rhythm that the family had built over years, the kitchen full again, the boys taking over the dinner preparation in rotation, the way they had since they were old enough to be trusted with knives, the twins following whichever brother happened to be cooking, with the specific devoted attention of small shadows. And on the third evening, after the girls were down and the house had gone quiet in its particular late evening way, Aaliyah gathered the whole family at the kitchen table, including Secretary Bay, who had been invited specifically, and had arrived in his good cardigan with the slightly anxious bearing of a man who suspected something significant was about to happen, and was uncertain whether to be excited or alarmed. "Sit," Aaliyah said, "I want to talk about your mother's memorial." The table went quiet in the specific way it always went quiet around this particular subject, not from discomfort, but from the careful attention the family had learned to give anything connected to the woman who had come before, who would always be specific and irreplaceable, and present in the shape of all 3 of her sons. "It's been a year since we did anything formal," she continued. "I know you each visit on your own, I know the date matters in your own private ways, but I want to do something together this year, all of us, including the girls." Hajin looked up at this. "The girls have never been." "I know," Aaliyah said. "I think it's time. They're old enough to understand the shape of it, even if they don't understand all of it yet, and I think she would want to know them. I think she'd want them there." She looked around the table at her sons. "I'd like to bring flowers, each of us, something we choose ourselves, not arranged by anyone else. I'd like each of you to say something, if you want to, or say nothing, if that's what you need. And I'd like to be there too, not instead of her, never instead of her, just beside her, the way I've tried to be beside all of you." Taeyun was quiet for a long moment. his jaw working the specific way it worked when something moved through him that he was deciding how much to show. "I'd like that," he said, finally. Junso nodded, his usual easy expression replaced by something quieter and more solid. Hajin looked at Aaliyah for a long moment, his large, calm eyes steady. "She would have liked you," he said. "I've told you that before. I mean it more every year that passes." They went on a Saturday morning, the whole family together, Wu Jin driving the lead car with Aaliyah beside him, and the twins in the back, the three boys following in their own cars. A small procession moving through the quiet outskirts of the city, to the cemetery, where Im Soo-jin had rested for 13 years. The morning was clear and warm, early summer light falling soft through the trees that lined the path, and the family walked together toward the modest, well-kept grave, each of them carrying flowers they had chosen themselves. Taeseun had brought white chrysanthemums, traditional and exact. Junso had brought a bright, warm arrangement of sunflowers that he explained, when his father glanced at the unconventional choice, had been because he remembered, from photographs, that his mother had always seemed to be smiling in pictures taken outdoors in summer, and he had wanted to bring her something that matched that. Hajin carried a single, perfect branch of cherry blossom, out of season and specially sourced, because cherry blossoms had been blooming the week she died, and he had decided, years ago, privately, that the flower would always belong to her in his mind. Woojin carried no flowers of his own. He carried, instead, a small framed photograph, one Aaliyah had found in an old box and had quietly restored and reframed without telling him until that morning, of Soo-jin laughing, young and unguarded, in a way none of the boys had ever seen her, because by the time they were old enough to remember her clearly, the weight of the world had already begun to settle on her shoulders. Aaliyah carried white roses, simple and clean, and held Sua's hand on one side, while Jia held Woojin's hand on the other, both girls carrying small single blossoms that Aaliyah had picked from the garden that morning, specifically for them to place themselves. They stood together at the grave, the whole family, and one by one they laid their flowers. Taeyeon went first, kneeling to set the chrysanthemums with the same careful precision he brought to everything, and said quietly, "I finished my first year. I think you would have been proud. I'm trying to build something real, the way you would have wanted." He paused. "I found someone. I haven't told her about you yet. Properly. I will. I want her to know who you were." Junso knelt next, placing the sunflowers, and his voice, when it came, had none of its usual easy lightness. "I scored the winning goal this season," he said. "I looked for someone in the crowd after, the way you would have wanted me to look for you. I found someone else instead. I think that's allowed. I think you'd want that for me." He touched the edge of the headstone gently. "I think about you every time I make someone laugh. I think that's where I got it from." Hajin placed the cherry blossom branch last among the brothers, and was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "I learned to embroider," he said, finally, the specific randomness of the detail landing with its own particular weight. "I don't know why I'm telling you that first. I made things for my sisters. You have 2 daughters now, did anyone tell you that? Su-ah and Jia. They're extraordinary. I think you'd recognize parts of yourself in both of them, in ways I can't fully explain yet." He paused. "I found someone too. She doesn't move easily, the way you didn't move easily, from what Appa has told me. I think you'd like that about her." Wu Jin set the framed photograph against the base of the headstone and knelt there for a long moment in silence, his hand resting against the cool stone, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the specific weight of 13 years, compressed into a handful of sentences. "I built something good," he said. "After everything. I want you to know that. I found someone who taught our sons how to be soft, without being weak, and I have 2 daughters who say Appa in Korean now, and call her Mom, without anyone asking them to, and I think, if you can see any of this from wherever you are, I think you would be glad. I think you would tell me I waited too long to let myself be happy. You'd be right." He paused. "Thank you for them, for all 3 of them. I carried it alone for a long time, and I don't have to anymore." Then he stood, and looked at Aaliyah, and nodded. She knelt with the girls, helping Suah place her single blossom first, guiding her small hand gently, and Suah, with the careful solemnity she brought to important things, said, in her careful new Korean, "Annyeonghaseyo, Omoni." "Hello, mother." The word landed across the quiet morning, with the specific weight of a child claiming a relationship she had never been told to claim, simply because she understood, in the particular way small children understand things adults overcomplicate, that this was family, and family deserved greeting. Jijia placed her blossom next to her sister's, and said nothing, but pressed her small palm flat against the grass beside the headstone, the same gesture she made when she wanted to touch something she had decided mattered. Aaliyah placed her own white roses last, and remained kneeling for a long moment, the whole family gathered quietly around her. "I never got to know you," she said softly. "But I know your sons completely, every part of them, the parts that are entirely their own, and the parts I think came from you. I've tried to love them the way I imagine you would have wanted them loved, fiercely and honestly, without asking them to be anything other than exactly who they are." She touched the edge of the headstone gently, the way Hajin had touched the same spot moments before. "Thank you for them. I mean that with my whole chest. I hope, wherever you are, that you know they are loved completely. All 5 of your children. Because I count the girls as yours too, in the way that matters. We're one family. We always will be. The morning held them there a while longer, the whole family quiet together in the early summer light, and when they finally turned to leave, Sua looked back once at the headstone and said, with the simple clear logic of a 2.5-year-old who had absorbed everything around her, without anyone needing to explain it directly, she's part of our family too, even though she's not here. Yes, baby, Aaliyah said, taking her hand. She always will be. Secretary Bei's honor came 2 weeks later, on an evening Wu Jin had been planning since the previous winter, and that he had kept from nearly everyone in the household until the final details locked into place, because he had decided that the one person who deserved to be surprised most, after 30 years of never once being the center of anything, was the man who had spent his entire adult life making sure other people were. The dinner was held at the same private venue that had hosted the boy's 18th birthday, the high-ceilinged room, warm with low gold light, though this time the guest list was smaller and more deliberate, the family at its center, a circle of the company's senior staff, who had known Secretary Bei for decades, and, by Wu Jin's specific and quiet instruction, 3 of the original household maids who had survived more than a few months under the triplets' early reign and who arrived, looking somewhere between honored and faintly nervous to be back in this house's orbit at all. Secretary Bei had been told only that there was a small family dinner to celebrate the boys' return from their first year, which was true enough not to register as a lie, and he arrived in his good cardigan again, the same one from the memorial, smoothed and pressed for the occasion, and stood in the doorway of the venue taking in the room, with the particular confusion of a man trying to reconcile a guest list with a stated purpose, and finding the numbers did not add up. There are considerably more people here than a family dinner requires, he said to Aaliyah, who had met him at the door, specifically so she could watch his face do exactly what it was doing. Sit down, Secretary Bei, she said. You'll understand shortly. He sat. The dinner proceeded for the first hour exactly as a warm family gathering should, the twins running between tables in their good dresses, the boys recounting stories from the semester for the benefit of guests who had not yet heard them, and Secretary Bei relaxed slowly into the rhythm of it, his guard lowering by degrees, until Wu Jin stood at the head of the room with a glass in his hand, and the gathering settled into quiet. 30 years ago, Wu Jin began, a man came to work for my father. He was given a household that had, by then, already absorbed the weight of what our family was, and he was told, in essence, to manage it, and ask no questions. He looked at Secretary Bei directly. He did far more than that. He managed 3 teenage sons who drove out 11 members of staff in 4 months, and somehow never once complained to me that the job had become impossible, though it absolutely had. He found, when I asked him to find someone unmovable, a woman who changed every single one of our lives. His eyes moved to Aaliyah, and back. He has buried family members and missed personal milestones because this household needed him, and he never once made any of us feel the weight of that sacrifice. He simply kept showing up. Secretary Bei's hand had found his own glass and was gripping it with a tightness that suggested he understood, finally, where this was heading, and had no intention of being able to stop it. Tonight, Wu Jin continued, on behalf of this family and this company, I want to recognize 30 years of service that built the foundation everything else in this house was able to stand on. He gestured, and an assistant came forward with a framed commendation, the company's formal seal at its center, and beside it, a smaller velvet box. The board has approved a lifetime honorary directorship in your name, with full benefits and recognition, for as long as you wish to remain involved with this family in whatever capacity you choose. And this house has approved something else entirely, which is simply our gratitude, in whatever form it takes. Secretary Bei stood, slowly, his composure entirely gone now, and Junso, watching from the family table with his phone already raised, because he had clearly anticipated this moment would require documentation, caught the exact second the old man's face broke open completely. I never expected, Secretary Bei started, and could not finish the sentence, his voice giving out entirely. Sua, who had wandered to his side during the speech without anyone noticing, looked up at him and reached for his hand with the simple directness of a child, responding to an adult who was clearly sad, except this sadness, she seemed to understand instinctively, was the good kind. Don't cry, Secretary Bei, she said, patting his hand. It's a happy thing. The whole room laughed, warm and immediate, and Secretary Bei looked down at the small girl holding his hand, and laughed too, through the tears he had stopped trying to hide, and said, It is a happy thing. Thank you for telling me. The evening's second surprise came later, when Secretary Bei, still flushed with the weight of his honor, found himself seated beside a woman he had not seen in nearly 2 years, a former colleague from the company's administrative office named Yoon Hee, who had retired the previous spring and who had been invited. Aaliyah explained when he asked, because the family had learned, through the specific quiet network that ran the household, that Secretary Bei had once mentioned her name with an inflection that suggested it mattered more than he had ever said aloud. You didn't have to do this, he told Aaliyah quietly, glancing across the table at Yoon-hee, who was deep in conversation with one of the other former maids. I didn't do anything, Aaliyah said, with the specific innocence that fooled absolutely no one. I simply made sure the right people received invitations to a dinner you were already attending. He did not argue further. He spent the rest of the evening in quiet, careful conversation with Yoonhee and Secretary Bae, who had spent 30 years arranging other people's lives with meticulous care, and had never once arranged his own. Proposed marriage to her 8 months later, in the same venue, on an evening Aaliyah had once again quietly orchestrated, and the entire Im family attended the wedding the following spring, the twins as flower girls in matching cream dresses, the boys standing as groomsmen at his specific request, and Woojin gave the toast, and said simply that the only thing he had ever wanted to give the man who had given his family 30 years was a single evening of being looked after instead of doing the looking after, and that he was glad, finally, someone else would be sharing that responsibility for the rest of his life. Woojin gifted both couple a house that left Secretary Bae crying. The gift Aaliyah had promised Hajin, the one that had been forming since his 18th birthday, and the 40-minute video from her parents and her brothers, arrived in its full and complete form 3 weeks after Secretary Bae's wedding, on a morning in early July, when a black car collected the entire family from the house at 5 in the morning and drove them to a private airfield outside Seoul, where Woojin's jet sat waiting on the tarmac, engines already warming. "Where are we going?" Jicha had asked, half asleep against Hajin's shoulder in the back seat of the car, because no one had told either twin anything beyond pack a bag. "We're traveling." "You'll see," Hajin said, and his voice had a quality to it that Aaliyah recognized immediately, the careful, contained excitement of a person who knew exactly what was coming, and had decided not to spoil a single second of it. They had not flown to Hajin's destination, however. They had flown the opposite direction entirely, west across the ocean toward Atlanta, because the gift, in its final and truest form, had never been about sending Hajin home. It had been about bringing home to him and to all of them. And Woojin had spent the better part of 3 months quietly arranging exactly that, sending his own jet to collect Aaliyah's parents and her 2 younger brothers and fly them, for the first time in either of their lives, across an ocean to a country they had only ever seen through photographs and video calls. Aaliyah had not been told. This had been the one piece of the plan Woojin had kept entirely to himself, working with Hajin in quiet coordination over months, the two of them building the surprise together with the specific patient thoroughness that defined everything Hajin touched. And when the family jet landed in Seoul, rather than continuing toward Atlanta, and Aaliyah, confused, asked why they had stopped, Woojin had simply taken her hand and led her toward the private terminal lounge, and through the glass doors, she had seen them, her mother and father, standing with her 2 brothers, all 4 of them having flown in on a separate jet that had landed an hour earlier, specifically so they could be there waiting when the family arrived. Aaliyah had not made it more than 3 steps into the terminal before her composure failed entirely, and she crossed the remaining distance at something closer to a run, and her mother, seeing her, did the same, and the 2 of them met in the middle of the terminal floor, in an embrace that contained 3 years of phone calls and video chats, and every single thing that distance could not fully carry across an ocean. "You're here," Aaliyah said, into her mother's shoulder, her voice breaking entirely. "How are you here? Ask your husband," her mother said, laughing through her own tears, pulling back to look at her daughter's face properly. "And that beautiful boy of yours, the quiet one, he's the reason we're standing here." Aaliyah turned to look at Hajin, who was standing slightly apart from the reunion, with the twins on either side of him, watching his mother's face with the specific quiet satisfaction of someone who has spent months building toward exactly this moment and has just watched it land perfectly. "Hajin," she said, "you did this." "Appa did most of the actual arranging," Hajin said. "I just told him what I wanted to give you. He's the one who sent the jet." She crossed to him and held his face in both hands, the same gesture she had used the night he first called her mom, and said, "This is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Do you understand that? My whole family, in one place." "I told you I'd take you home," Hajin said. "I just brought home here instead." Her father, watching this exchange, cleared his throat loudly and said, "Are we going to stand in this airport all day, or is somebody going to introduce me to my grandchildren properly?" And Sua and Jia, who had been watching the entire reunion with the specific solemn fascination of children encountering relatives they had only seen on a screen, looked at each other and then ran toward him without any further prompting needed, because grandchildren, it turned out, required very little formal introduction to understand exactly who belonged to them. The 2 weeks that followed were, by unanimous family agreement afterward, among the best of their lives. Aaliyah's parents and brothers stayed in the house in the hills, the twins absolutely refusing to let their grandmother out of arm's reach for the first 3 days. Aaliyah's father and Woojin discovering, somewhat to everyone's surprise, an easy rapport built around a shared dry sense of humor that neither had displayed much of before, and Aaliyah's brothers, both in their 20s now, immediately attaching themselves to the triplets with the specific instant camaraderie of young men who recognized kindred chaos when they saw it. Jun-so, in particular, declaring within the first day that he had found his American soulmates. They cooked together every evening, Aaliyah's mother taking over the kitchen, with the easy authority of a woman who had taught her daughter everything she knew, and was delighted to discover how much of it had survived the journey across an ocean. And on the 4th evening, standing at the stove beside Aaliyah's mother, while the whole house filled with the smell of her spice blend, Hajin had said, quietly, "This is what the kitchen smelled like the first week she came to us." "I never told her." but I used to come down at night just to stand in it. Aaliyah's mother had looked at him for a long moment, and had reached over and touched his face the same way her daughter did, and said, "You're hers completely. I can see that. I'm glad she found all of you." They visited the memorial again during that visit, Aaliyah's mother insisting on it once she understood the significance, and she had stood at the grave of a woman she had never met, and said simply, "Thank you for the part of your sons that made room for my daughter. I hope you know she has loved them the way I raised her to love, completely, and without holding anything back." Before they left, on the final evening, Woo Jin had taken Aaliyah's father aside on the terrace, the city spread out gold and glittering below them, and had said, with the particular formal weight he brought to things that mattered, that he had wanted, for 3 years, to properly thank the man who had raised the woman who had walked into his house and rebuilt every single thing in it that had been broken, and that he intended to make sure this would not be the last visit, that the jet would be available whenever the family wanted it, for as long as he was breathing. Aaliyah's father had looked at him for a long moment, and had said, "Finally, you take good care of my daughter." "Every single day," Woo Jin said, "for the rest of both our lives." The family that gathered for dinner on the last night before the visit ended numbered 11, the boys home from university for the summer break that had just begun, the twins underfoot and overjoyed, Aaliyah's parents and brothers at the center of a table that had, 3 years earlier, belonged to 4 people learning to become a family, and now belonged to all of them, completely. It was the final ordinary perfect week before everything changed. The morning it happened was, in every way that mattered, exactly like 100 mornings before it. Aaliyah's parents and brothers had flown home 4 days earlier, the house settling back into its slightly quieter summer rhythm, the boys home and easy and full of plans for the break, and Aaliyah had left the house just after 2 in the afternoon to collect the twins from their summer program, the same drive she made 3 times a week, the same route, the same time, nothing about the day suggesting it would be anything other than what every other Tuesday had been. The family group chat, which had been quiet since the morning's usual round of good mornings, and a photo Jun-so had sent of the twins eating breakfast, with their faces covered in rice, lit up at 4:17 in the afternoon, with a message from Aaliyah's number, that none of them, reading it in the seconds and minutes that followed, would ever fully recover from. "Help. Someone help me. They took me. I don't know where." The message ended there. No further text came. 3 attempted calls back to her number went unanswered, then to voicemail. Then, on the 4th attempt, to a tone that meant the phone itself was no longer reachable at all. Tae-yoon saw it first, sitting in his room scrolling through his own phone, and the blood left his face so completely, and so fast, that Jun-so, glancing up from across the room, where he had been only half paying attention, knew something had happened, before Tae-yoon said a single word. "What?" Jun-so said, already standing. Tae-yoon turned his phone toward him without speaking, his hand shaking in a way none of his brothers had ever seen it shake, and Jun-so read the message once, and then read it again, certain he had misunderstood it the first time, and then was moving, shouting for Ha-jin, shouting for their father, the specific raw fear in his voice, carrying through the entire house, in a way that brought every single person in it running. Woo Jin read the message in his study, standing perfectly still for exactly 1 second, the same 1 second of absolute stillness that had once, years ago, stretched across a foyer, when he first saw a woman standing at the bottom of his staircase with a suitcase, and no idea what she had walked into. And then he was moving too, his phone already at his ear, his voice dropping into the flat, final register that none of his sons had heard directed at anything outside this family in years. "Pull every camera on her route," he said, into the phone, already crossing the study toward the door. "Now, I want the school's gate footage. I want every traffic camera between the house and the program. I want it in the next 4 minutes." Ha-jin had gone completely white, standing in the hallway with his phone in his hand, rereading the message for what must have been the 10th time, his usual stillness gone entirely, replaced by something coiled and barely contained. "The twins," he said, his voice cracking on the word. "If she was picking them up." He did not finish the sentence. None of them needed him to. Woo Jin was already calling the school directly, his voice carrying the absolute, unbending authority that had once made grown men in his organization step aside without question, demanding to know, immediately, whether his daughters had been collected from the program, by whom, and when, and the seconds that passed, while the line connected and the answer was sought, stretched into something that felt, to every person standing in that hallway, like an entirely different and considerably crueler version of time. Jun-so had his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, his jaw working, his usual warmth replaced entirely by something dark and absolute that none of his brothers had ever seen on his face before, and when he spoke, his voice was low and flat and carried none of its usual lightness at all. "If this is them," he said, "if this is the people who came before, I will end every single one of them myself." Tae-yoon, beside him, said nothing, but his expression had settled into the same cold, assessing stillness their father wore in the worst moments. The strategist's mind already working, already cataloging, already beginning to build the only thing he knew how to build when the world came apart, a plan. Woo Jin lowered the phone from his ear, his face a mask of something his sons had only seen directed at enemies, never once at the empty space where his wife should have been. "The twins are safe," he said, and the relief that moved through the hallway lasted exactly as long as it took him to finish the sentence. The school never released them. Aaliyah never arrived to collect them, which meant the message had been sent somewhere between the house and the school, on a route she had driven 1,000 times, on a road that had been, for 3 years, considered safe. "Get the cars," Woo Jin said, and his voice had dropped into something that was no longer the warm, complete father his sons had grown up watching change slowly over the past several years. It was the other version, the one beneath, the one his sons had heard about in fragments and had never once needed to see in full until this exact moment. "Get every man we have," he said. "Get the cameras, get the rival files from 3 years ago, get all of it." He looked at his 3 sons standing in the hallway of the house that a woman had walked into, with a suitcase and a jar of spices, and had made, irreversibly and completely, into a home. And his expression, for the first time any of them could remember, held nothing contained in it at all. "They have made a mistake," he said, "and I am going to make absolutely certain it is the last one they ever make." Subscribe to Afro-Korean Drama Empire, My Empire Family, because part 5 is coming, and it is not going to be gentle. Hit that notification bell. Tell everyone. We will see all of you in part 5.
Morning sunlight through the window, laughter dancing in the air, little footsteps down the hallway. Love is waiting everywhere. Different stories, different journeys, different skies we've traveled through. Now we're gathered round one table, making memories brand new. Hand in hand, side by side, no matter where the road may wind. Through every season, through every change, our hearts will always shine. This is home, this is us, built with love, built with trust. Every smile, every tear brings us closer year by year. Different roots, one family tree, growing strong for all to see. No matter where life leads, our hearts together will never be apart. Sunday dinners, shared tradition, stories told before bedtime. Every language, every culture blends together so divine. When the world feels cold and distant, when the storms begin to start, we find shelter in each other. We find home within our hearts. Hand in hand, side by side, no matter where the road may win. Through every season, through every change, our hearts will always shine. This is home, this is us, built with love, built with trust. Every smile, every tear brings us closer year by year. Different roots, one family tree, growing strong for all to see. No matter where life leads, our hearts together will never be apart. Through every dream, through every mile, we'll carry love with every smile. 1,000 memories yet to make, 1,000 adventures still awaiting. This is home, this is us, built with love, built with trust. Every moment, every day, love will always light the way. Different roots, one family tree, growing strong